Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because I know there's a lot of disagreement right now over what 2025 has in store for Bitcoin, but it truly feels like everything is lining up perfectly for a Bitcoin mania phase into late Q1 of next year. So the next 3 to 4 months should be incredible. We have some very powerful narratives like Trump and the Bitcoin US Strategic Reserve. We also have a new SEC chairman, which should be a huge improvement over the anti-crypto SEC we've had under Gary Gensler over the past few years. We also have the largest asset manager in the world, BlackRock, telling their clients that a 1 to 2% Bitcoin portfolio allocation is quite reasonable. And we have MicroStrategy, which is essentially a US corporation that uses debt to buy Bitcoin and add it to their balance sheet, getting added to one of the most popular indices in the world, the Nasdaq 100, which should result in some serious passive flows as investors buy that popular ETF. And last but not least, we have very clean bullish price structure and strong momentum as Bitcoin continues to grind higher and close weekly candles above 100,000. And this is exactly why I named my free weekly report yesterday It's Time to Lock In, because this is not only the most exciting and profitable phase of the cycle, it's also the one where greed and euphoria are the highest and the one where investors make the most costly mistakes. I've experienced this type of media attention and investor sentiment only 2 times before. Once was in late 2017 and the other was in early 2021. In mid-2017, the CME futures for Bitcoin got approved, and this was a huge deal that made everybody go crazy because it was going to be the first ever institutional Bitcoin product. And the narrative at the time was, here come the institutions, 50K Bitcoin, here we come, but we ended up topping out at 20K and getting ahead of ourselves and entering a bear market. In 2021, it was MicroStrategy adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet and Tesla following soon after, and the narrative at the time was laser eyes until 100K. All of the companies are going to follow MicroStrategy and Tesla, and once again we got a bit ahead of ourselves and entered a bear market. And that narrative today is the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. The US is going to have one. Nation states around the world are going to start competing over Bitcoin. 500K Bitcoin, here we come. And that can result in very bullish price action in the short term, but it's likely we get a bit ahead of ourselves once again and enter a larger correction eventually. And what you'll notice is that institutional investor narrative of 2017 ended up being quite accurate a few years later, now that we have those spot Bitcoin ETFs and we see a lot of institutional buying of Bitcoin, and perhaps MicroStrategy and Tesla were just early in 2021, and we're seeing that Bitcoin balance sheet playbook getting a lot more common now. So a lot of these narratives do end up coming true somewhat eventually, but investors just tend to get greedy and tend to take on too much leverage and tend to get ahead of themselves with all of the excitement and media attention that we see during these mania phases. And you can see that investor greed very clearly whether you look at the fear and greed index or look at the put to call ratio. In orange, we have the call buying being done by investors on the CME. As you can see in orange, the amount of people betting on upside is significantly higher than the amount of people betting on downside in purple, which is the polar opposite of what we see in bear markets. Obviously, people bet on downside more when we're in a downtrend, and you can see the recent volume in call buying completely dwarfs what we saw in 2021, and that's of course because of all of the price targets and all of the excitement and euphoria we're seeing on Twitter and YouTube. We have some investors talking about 115K for Bitcoin as a target, and then we have others talking about their base case being 140K per Bitcoin, and then of course we have others saying the cycle target should be a minimum of 175,000, but we could even go as high as 461K per Bitcoin. And this is exactly why the Q1 2025 top remains my base case. I have no idea exactly how Bitcoin's price will go. That's why I try to focus a little bit more on a time-based approach and very slow and steady profit taking along the way. I know there's a lot of investors that think we can rally until Q4 of 2025, but I don't think it's possible that we can maintain this type of sentiment and media attention and greed for another 12 months. And this market cycle has been ahead of schedule over and over and over again with the all-time high break we saw before the halving and the very intense run-up we're seeing right now before we even enter the post-halving year. And I also believe the very same narratives that are sending Bitcoin higher right now are also going to be the reason for our early peak. Right now, there's a ton of talk of an executive order from Trump to buy $20 billion worth of Bitcoin next year. But what many market participants ignore is that the US government already holds over $20 billion of Bitcoin and 1% of the supply. So Trump announcing this will not be sold and will instead be hodled is already him fulfilling his promise of a Bitcoin strategic reserve, and he doesn't have to raise the debt to go out and buy it on the market, which would cause price to skyrocket and front run those purchases. Not to mention, we have a huge portion of the supply held by US-based corporations like MicroStrategy, the publicly traded miners, and Tesla, not to mention Coinbase and Robinhood that aren't on this list, but also custody a ton of Bitcoin, and those corporations have to answer to the US government. And we also have major institutions like BlackRock and Fidelity that are absorbing so much of the supply via the spot ETFs on behalf of US investors, and they have to answer to the US government as well. So if you ask me, I think the US already has a Bitcoin strategic reserve between the US government's holdings and what's being held by US corporations and institutions, and the US will benefit greatly off of the success of Bitcoin over the next few years. As for the new SEC chairman narrative, it's really bullish in the short term that we're finally going to be getting some regulatory clarity for these crypto companies and crypto projects. But what this ignores in the long term is that we still have to overcome this issue of these projects not really getting that much usage and not that much adoption except for a select few and maybe stable coins like Tether and USDC. Not to mention, we also continue to see huge investor and founding team unlocks of all of these tokens. This week, we saw $3 billion worth of tokens unlocking, and the founders and investors are already so rich once these unlocks happen that the likelihood of them holding on to those coins is quite low, and they're a lot more likely to move it into something safer like Bitcoin, Ethereum, maybe stable coins. And we have 1 billion in unlocks roughly next week. We have another 1 billion the week after that, another 1 billion the week after that, and then we have 5 billion in the second week of January. So we still have to deal with this issue in the longer term of all of this unlock sell pressure coming from these newer projects and from these seed investors and founding team members. So although a new SEC chairman and regulatory clarity is an amazing narrative in the short term, we still have a lot of problems we need to figure out in the longer term. As for BlackRock recommending a Bitcoin allocation in their clients' portfolios, this is incredibly bullish in the short term as well, and we've seen incredible inflows coming into these products, hundreds of millions of dollars each and every day, piling into these Bitcoin spot ETFs. But that's because it's really easy to buy Bitcoin right now with all of the price momentum and excitement we have. But just as these investors bought Bitcoin on the way up with all of the media attention and the bullish narratives and all of the excitement, they could also start selling those ETF products if Bitcoin were to start going down, or if the S&P 500 were to go down, or if something bad were to happen in macro, now that so much Bitcoin is being held by the same investors and it can be so easily sold on those brokerages. As for MicroStrategy getting added to the NASDAQ 100, this narrative is also incredibly bullish in the short term because MicroStrategy will start receiving those passive ETF inflows from investors buying the NASDAQ via the QQQ or some other popular ETF. However, the MicroStrategy chart tells a very familiar story. In the 2021 cycle, we saw a first reaccumulation, a second reaccumulation, and then a big gap up into a major blow off top. And this cycle, we've seen something quite similar. We've had a first reaccumulation, a second reaccumulation, and then once that narrative of the QQQ edition started, we saw a huge gap up into a big blow off top. So is history going to repeat itself as MicroStrategy cools off now that Michael Saylor is piling into Bitcoin at high prices, because that's when the debt markets are willing to give him the most money. Now, this doesn't mean MicroStrategy has to go down. It just means I think the upside is limited, especially when you see everybody raving over something called an infinite money glitch. And just like how Saylor was able to buy a lot of Bitcoin while MicroStrategy was doing well in 2021 and could buy almost no Bitcoin at cheap prices because raising debt was very difficult when the MicroStrategy stock was doing poorly, we're seeing something very similar happening today, just on a much larger scale. And the higher his cost basis goes, the harder it's going to get for him to raise debt and the more damage that can be done in the next bear market. So I'm really grateful for all of these amazing narratives we have right now, like the ones we had in 2021 and in 2017, but we know that narratives and investor sentiment tends to get ahead of itself, and I think it's only a matter of time before we enter a bear market and larger correction once again, and that's what we're going to continue looking out for. And the Bitcoin long-term holders seem to agree. We've been seeing a lot of profit taking ever since Bitcoin broke 100K, similar to the profit taking we saw once Bitcoin broke its all-time high in March of this year, and similar to what we saw before our correction in January of 2021. You can see this even easier on the coin days destroyed metric, which just looks at how long it's been since that coin last moved, multiplied by the amount of coins, and you can see these large spikes tend to happen near local tops and in mania phases, and it means we could still have a few months to go, but we are definitely no longer early in this market cycle, and it's unlikely that it can carry on for another 12 months until Q4 of 2025. So for now, I'll continue monitoring price structure. I remain optimistic as long as we continue to close weekly candles above 100K per Bitcoin. And my base case remains that we will grind higher over the next few months as long as we maintain that price structure. Of course, there's always a possibility of a black swan or some type of crazy news headline that triggers a pullback, but the more likely scenario is that we continue grinding higher, in my opinion. So we'll see what happens. I would love nothing more than to see this rally continue for another 12 months. I just don't think it's that likely. And I still think there's a very small percent chance that this could perhaps end a lot sooner than most investors anticipate. But my base case remains that we have a really fun few months ahead before we end up finding a major top for Bitcoin. And perhaps that could be driven by some issues in the macro backdrop. We know that global liquidity has been going down over the past few weeks, and Bitcoin tends to follow global liquidity with a 2 to 3 month lag, and we haven't seen that quite yet. The 3-month time frame points to late December, early January for that Bitcoin correction to occur. So we're going to continue monitoring that. Our leading indicator for global liquidity is the US dollar index. Are we putting in a lower high here before it rolls over, or is it about to get a higher low and a breakout? A lot of that is going to rely on tomorrow's pivotal FOMC meeting, where we have a 96% likelihood of another 25 basis point rate cut. But more importantly, we're going to be getting the economic projections for 2025 and what the Fed is forecasting for the weakening labor market and the stubborn inflation that we've seen over the past few months. And that should have a huge impact on the dollar index and on global liquidity. So how am I positioning myself for all of this? I'm still keeping the majority of my spot holdings to try and take advantage of this mania phase we could have over the next few weeks, but I'm slowly locking in small profits along the way. I wrote about that in detail in yesterday's free weekly report. As long as my cash position is below 30%, I will continue taking small profits as prices go higher, especially with how incredible of a year it's been for Solana, Bitcoin, and Ethereum. I still think Ethereum has higher to go. I do not believe in quintuple tops. There is just too much liquidity and FOMO that can take place if price breaks out here and goes higher. And that's when I think we'll see a lot more profit taking from larger holders and from whales. But as of right now, this looks like it wants to break higher. Even if there's a pullback in between, I still think we see Ethereum trade above 4K by end of year. And I think it's going to have an incredible Q1 2025 if this mania phase really kicks off. And the Ethereum spot ETF buyers seem to agree, because we've been seeing hundreds of millions of dollars of inflows coming into those Ethereum spot ETFs ever since Bitcoin broke above its previous all-time high. and investors are seeing more opportunity buying Ethereum at current prices compared to Bitcoin. As for Solana, still consolidating above our previous range high, I have no concerns as long as we're above $200. I know a lot of people are getting frustrated that it hasn't done much over the past few weeks, but that's really because Ethereum has been stealing some of that attention since Ethereum has lagged so much this cycle and Solana has performed so well so early in the cycle, but I still think Solana breaks higher and sees new all-time highs before this cycle is over. As for traditional markets, the S&P 500 is still consolidating, perhaps waiting for what we're going to hear from Powell at the press conference tomorrow at the FOMC meeting and what we're going to see in the 2025 economic projections. And as long as the S&P 500 isn't falling off a cliff, I can remain optimistic that Bitcoin can continue rallying higher, especially because the federal government is still running huge deficits, and eventually those deficits are going to have to get monetized, which will result in an increase in the money supply and a devaluation of the fiat currency, which should be good for our risk assets like the S&P 500 and definitely good for Bitcoin. But anyway, let me know what you expect. Is today's price action similar to 2021 and similar to late 2017? Or is this a new super cycle where Bitcoin is just going to skyrocket higher for the next 12 to 18 months and we're going to see something we've never seen before? Would love to know what you expect. As always, thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.